Good afternoon. I'm glad to present the second part of the session on support and evaluation of education and training policies, synergies between institutions. And also in this part of session, we look at paper with with the use of many type of data. And in fact, now we start with Marco Tonello, Lucia Rizzica, she is here, Eleonora Porreca, with the Great Recession, Students' Aspiration Choice during the Great Recession. They work at Bank of Italy, and Lucia, the floor is yours.
Great. So the audio is fine, all right. So thanks a lot for this opportunity to present today. It's also my first presentation in live in person, so I am particularly happy to be here today and to see people in front of me rather than the screen only. So this is a paper which is joint work with Marco Tonello and Eleonora Porreca, who work at the Bank of Italy as well as I do. So we like to start this presentation with a quote. Apologies for the non-Italian speakers, I'll translate it quickly. So Paola Mastrocola is a novelist, and she's also a former teacher and wrote several essays about the world of schools. And basically what she says in this quote here is that there's many reasons why people don't study today. And there is a kind of more recent one, new one, which is almost becoming an alibi, and that reason is the economic crisis. So people now start say they don't study because there's no work, so why studying? And you hear this everywhere. And this quote is in a way the spirit of this paper. So trying to understand whether there is a link between the business cycle and educational choices and educational intentions. The idea a bit of the paper, if you like, is to see also when this thing appears, and this allows us to say also when we can act and try to avoid having like human capital loss. So basically, we studied the relationship between macroeconomic conditions and the aspirations of students towards higher education. These aspirations will be measured, so we will focus on the period on the end of compulsory education, so when kids are 15, more or less. The reason why focusing on aspirations is that I think it's a kind of new and promising stream of research, because the idea is that aspirations actually shape individuals' incentives to invest, and human capital accumulation is the most classical example of this. So here I've put just two references. Jennicott and Ray is a very famous paper in development, whereby they build a model in which low aspirations can generate poverty traps. So because people have low aspirations, they don't make investments, and this kind of condemns them to poverty. And then Eliana La Ferrara wrote a kind of review of the literature a couple of years ago, and however there are a lot more recent papers on the topic. So if aspirations do shape individuals' incentives to invest in education, the idea is that macroeconomic conditions can affect human capital accumulation, not just at the moment in which the choice is done, but also at earlier stages. And so aspirations can be in a way a kind of early warning of what will actually eventually happen to human capital accumulation. And that's what we're going to look at in the paper. So what do we see from the raw data? This is very simply data from Italy, and they show the relationship over time between unemployment and enrollment in university. And the pattern here is quite clear. So you see that enrollments in education, in tertiary education, so at university, kind of procyclical. When unemployment is lowest, enrollments were highest, and vice versa. The shaded area is the period on which we will focus in the paper. If we look at aspirations, the picture that we get is much more blurred, much less clear. The first, so these are data from OECD PISA. So these are questions which are asked to kids when they're 15, more or less, and they're asked whether they wish to continue in education after compulsory schooling. That's the first panel, and whether they later on want to go to university, and that's the second panel. And what you see is that in the first panel, which is a kind of short run choice, so it's a choice that they will make the year after, the line is kind of negative. So this is more in line with the previous graph. So when unemployment is highest, the desire to stay in education is lower. The opposite seems to be the case for longer run choices, tertiary education. So the overall picture that we get from the raw data doesn't give us a clear idea of what is going on, and that's why we try to give more precise estimates of this relationship in the paper. In terms of the existing literature, I would say that we stand at the junction between these three main topics. So the first one is actually a literature which is quite established and robust on the labor market effects of graduating during a recession. So there are many well-published papers that study what happens to students who just happen to graduate and thus enter the labor market in particularly bad times. And these are people who have worse labor market outcomes in the long run. So there is a scarring effect and a negative effect in the long run. We will essentially borrow from this literature the idea of how to identify and isolate these effects. We won't be looking at the moment in which people graduate, but we will look at students earlier on and see whether we can see signals of effects of the recession, in this case, at an earlier age. There are surprisingly not many papers, I think surprisingly, on that look directly at educational choices during a recession. And the results are kind of mixed. So some papers find that students tend to stay more in education in bad times because the opportunity cost of education is lower. So they invest more in their human capital. Some find the opposite. I suppose it also depends on the context. So one paper, Adamopoulos and Tanzi, is for Italy. Blemer and Quincy look at the US. So it's also very different institutional setting. But it's not a question that, at least in my opinion, has had as much attention as it should have. And then there's the literature on aspirations and human capital accumulation, to which on which I've worked a lot in the past with respect to the UK. So overall, I would say that what we have learned from this literature are two things. So one thing is that aspirations are actually closely linked to actual choices in terms of education. And the second thing is, so they do have a lot of predictive power. And the second thing that we've learned is that they're malleable. So teenagers' aspirations are not fixed and then unchangeable, but they can be somehow shaped. So there's also room for policy here. So in the paper we study, as I was saying, as I've been saying so far, the economic cycle and aspirations, and we will also focus on gender differences to see whether boys and girls react differently. The short answer is yes, they do, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the data. So we use the INVALSI questionnaire for the years, academic years 2010-2011 till 17-18. So we have 8 years. During these 8 years, there was a question in the student questionnaire asking pupils to state what was the highest educational level that they wished to attain. So they were in 10th grade, which means they were 15, and they were asked whether they wanted, so we can understand from here whether they wanted to continue and then whether they wanted to enroll in university later on. From ISTAT, instead, we build the indicators of local labor market conditions. We will essentially rely on regional measures, but we do have a specification based on local labor market measures as well. So from this question, we build 2 variables. So the first one, we call it secondary, and it's a binary variable that is one when the student states that he wants to stay on in education after compulsory education, and so complete secondary education, and 0 otherwise, so if he wants to drop out. And then for those who have stated that they wish conditional on staying on, we build another variable, which is 1 if they declare that they also want to enroll in university when they will be at the end of secondary school. 0 otherwise. So we call this secondary and tertiary aspirations. Okay, so I won't go through the descriptive statistics, just to say that we essentially use both demographic characteristics. We have information on the socioeconomic situation of the family, and the parents' education, the type of school that the students are attending, and then we will rely a lot on these measures of previously accumulated skills. So the grade they got in the previous term, the grade they got in the previous year, and also the grade in junior high school. The last 2 rows are our measures of aspirations. What is interesting here is that I suppose this is not new for those who work a bit on gender differences, but the aspirations towards tertiary education of girls are much higher than those of boys. Well, in fact, the enrollment rates are higher as well. So in terms of raw correlations over time, this is our measure of secondary education aspiration. And this graph is quite similar to what we had seen at the beginning. So when unemployment is highest, the desire to stay on in education goes down. So aspirations are lower. If we see the same, if we look at the same, do the same picture for tertiary education instead, we don't see much relationship. So actually this tertiary education aspirations are kind of flat. So we try to retrieve a causal estimate of the business cycle on the aspirations in a regression in which we essentially rely on the variation across years within schools. So we're going to have school fixed effects, and we look at the same schools over the years, and we have year fixed effects. So we kind of clean our estimates of the aggregate trend. We also have some controls for student characteristics, some controls for the class and the school, and we have also these class fixed effects where the class is just a group of students studying together every year. And then our regressor of interest is the unemployment rate at the regional level in the previous 12 months before these students were asked the question. Do we have enough variability to identify this effect? We believe so. So this is the variation coefficient. Basically, the maps show the variability of the unemployment rate within year across regions, and you see that it kind of varies already. And overall, we have so this varies between 0 and 100, and so we kind of have quite high variability to identify the effect of interest. And there we go with our baseline results. So the first panel, the upper panel, is the impact on secondary education aspirations, and this is quite robustly negative. So what are we controlling for? So we are progressively adding more control variables. The last column, which is our preferred specification, is the one in which we are controlling for some measure of previously accumulated skills, because the idea is that of course, students who are better at school tend to have higher aspirations towards higher education. So we want to take that as given and see over and above that how these aspirations vary. So you see that the coefficient in the upper panel is constantly and robustly negative. So it is essentially an elasticity, so 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate lowers the willingness to stay on in education by 0.3 percentage points. And this is constant for, across specifications. When we look at tertiary education, so the desire to go to university, this instead seems to be positive, but actually becomes null as soon as we control for previous ability, previous skills. So what we get from this baseline results is that there is a robust discouragement effect on in the short run, so in desire to go on in education, and essentially no effect on the longer run decisions of staying, of going to university. We did some heterogeneities. So these are for secondary education aspirations. The effect is always significantly negative across groups, but it is more negative for low socioeconomic status students. So people, also immigrants and people in lower quartiles of the socioeconomic measure. In terms of tertiary education aspirations, on the other hand, the effect is true, it's always not significant, but we do see that is in terms of magnitude, it kind of gets significantly larger when we look at more marginal students. So those in non-academic schools, non-tertiary, parents who do not have a tertiary education degree or are from the poorest quartiles of the distribution. So there is room for hope that these people are actually changing their aspirations. But the heterogeneity that, as I was saying at the beginning, we are mostly interested in is the gender one. So the first two columns show our baseline regression for males and females. The negative coefficient that we found on secondary education aspirations is quite similar for boys and girls, though larger for boys. Interestingly, though, girls react differently from boys in terms of longer term aspirations. So when faced with less favorable labor market conditions, they tend to respond that they will more likely go to university, whereas boys are not affected. And this is particularly true for those from less affluent families, if you like, so with parents who do not have a tertiary education degree. So this is, I mean, I don't know, I'm a fan of gender economics, but this is something that I found super interesting because it kind of talks to a literature that says that men and women react differently to shocks, and women tend to be more forward-looking and react less and to invest more in the longer run. We do some robustness checks. Mainly, I mean, I would focus more on these ones. We try to use different measures of previously acquired ability. The reason why we use eventually the previous term grade is just that it leaves us with the largest sample. But if we change, we do lose observations, but we get the same results. Here, very quickly, we basically try to disentangle what can be the underlying story. So is it that because unemployment, is it that I do not go to, I drop out of school because I want to help my family, or is it because it is the prospective labor market conditions that discourage me? So in order to do this, we we use different unemployment rates. The one that would, let's say, concern me today, which is the first one, and the prospective one that I see, which is the second one. And they kind of, and these regressions kind of say that it is more the prospective labor market conditions that that shape choices of students. So just to conclude the last 2 minutes, where are we going? So what I've presented today is super preliminary work that we've done so far. And we were very happy to present them here because we have all the experts of this data and of the topic. But what we want to do next is trying to link this data with, so we identified essentially 2 information which would give a lot of value added to the work. So the one is the grade obtained at the high school diploma, because this is information that gives us 2 contributions. It tells us whether aspirations translated into effort. So take the case of girls, they raise their aspirations towards higher education. Did that translate into more effort and higher human capital accumulated? And that is something that we can see measuring their improvements over time in terms of grades. So we would need some grades at the end of secondary school. And then it would actually tell us whether they really continued in education or not until the diploma, which is our a validation of our measure of secondary education aspirations. And then eventually it would be cool to see whether they actually enrolled in tertiary education as well. So if these tertiary education aspirations did translate into tertiary education attainment, which is probably at the end of the day, the most relevant part. So to conclude, this paper, super preliminary, apologies for this, but shows us that the economic downturn that was experienced in the last decade raised the intentions to drop out after compulsory education for students in a significant way. Despite this, the good news is that for those who wanted to remain in education, at least girls stated that they were intention to go to university more than before. From a policy perspective, this is, I've probably been saying it through all the time, but this is interesting because these aspirations can be guided somehow. And so the idea is that if we know that this happens in bad times, students get discouraged, and this translates into lower effort in education and lower educational attainment, we can actually plan some policies, some outreach activities, and some support activities to stop this when we're still on time before it's too late. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to hear any comments or questions. And I also have my co-authors who are online, so if the questions are difficult, I'll switch to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Any questions? Any questions? Okay.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I just wonder if you can say some more words or about how you, because you said you control in some specification for grades, which I think you mean teachers' marks.
Yes.
And then you also have some robustness using INVALSI data, right? Test scores, basically, instead than teachers' marks.
Yes.
And sorry, just the second part of the question, and then I finish. And of course, we know that aspirations are very correlated with test scores and teacher marks. So I wonder, but I don't know, I never thought about it before, but it's very interesting and challenging if there is, I mean, if you have explored the relationship between unemployment and test scores instead than unemployment and aspirations.
Yeah, so we are controlling for grades rather than INVALSI score for one reason. The reason is that we want to, so in my opinion, the INVALSI score, contemporaneous INVALSI score, are more an outcome than a control, which is what you are saying in the second part of your question. So, however, I think that the most important outcome in terms of performance would be, it would be more correct to measure it a few years later. So if I'm seeing that you're feeling discouraged today, do I see that in 2-3 years time you do worse at school? So that is the type of score that we would like to measure. And for the same reason, the other measures of skills that we use are always grades rather than the INVALSI score, because we would like to have it before rather than the contemporaneous one. So in fact, I mean, I went quite quickly on the robustness, but the only specification in which we control for the contemporaneous INVALSI score, we still get the positive correlation that we are arguing it is spurious, and that disappears only when we control for something some previously accumulated skill rather than contemporaneous one.
Question? Michele?
Yeah. Maybe I arrived a little bit late. You mentioned the desired qualification administered in the INVALSI test at grade 10. Just an observation that it's quite differentiated between lyceum and vocational institutes and technical institutes.
Yes, I haven't shown much descriptives about this. In the regressions, it's fine. We always have school fixed effects, so this is kind of controlled for. But clearly, there are. I mean, it's a question that is interesting to look at descriptively from many sides, and there are huge differences between technical and academic schools. However, when we do the regressions, we always see that, let's say, the malleable part, the ones that do move are the ones in technical schools, which makes sense. They're more marginal. The probability of the aspirations towards tertiary education for those in academic schools is kind of 95%. So it's not something that moves a lot.
Other questions? No? Oh, yes.
Thank you, Lucia. Can you just repeat your identification strategy, please? Because according to what I understood, so you are putting together different waves of INVALSI. You take grade 10 and you have school fixed effects, and then you compare cohorts within school.
Yeah.
But how do you take into account the possibility that cores have been hit not only by the contemporaneous economic condition, but also by past and different economic conditions? How can you attribute to the current unemployment rate the effect you find?
Yeah, I mean, so
because you are all the 10 cores. So you're
so
using
the ideal exercise here would be to have a measure of aspirations 1 year before with which to control for and so just have the change in aspirations due to the change in the local labor market conditions. We don't have that. So the best that we can do, I mean, you understood our identification correctly. You perfectly understood what is the weakness of that. So the best that we can do, at least I think that's the best that we can do, is having these controls for previously accumulated skills that kind of tell us what is the situation, the previous situation of the student. Ideally, it would be great to have the aspirations before, but that was asked only once, so we can't do much better.
Okay, the question online, no? No, okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.